All right, I think we're going to get started a couple minutes early here. Who's doing CTC? Anyone want the code? Need the code? Nobody? Oh, we got a few people. All right, I'll leave it up for you. Everyone good? All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about medical device security research. Spent the last 4 years working on. A little bit of background. I'm an associate director with Protiviti. I'm out of the Los Angeles office, so I work in healthcare security. I lead the medical device security practice at the firm. Just over 15 years in IT security. Started out in the Marine Corps, and I've also spent just over 5 years managing information security on the healthcare provider side before coming over to consulting. So I do have, industry experience in the healthcare environment. So I do have a fairly good background on the overall, healthcare industry and healthcare vertical as well. And the last 4 years, I've spent, researching vulnerabilities in connected medical devices as it relates to more so, patient safety issues, not necessarily privacy. So this is what we're going to cover. Quick recaps on some of my previous research. I'll try to point out too, so this is only 30 minutes, so some of it's fairly high level. We got to go pretty quick, but I'll try to point out like various areas on like previous DEF CON talks that have gone into depth on each of these areas if you want to go, take a look at those, anything like that. So first off, why did I get into it? Why am I passionate about medical device security? Why does it matter to me? There was a few things, right? So I don't know, is there anyone in this room that relies on a medical device, diabetic, insulin, anything like that? Anyone have any family members that rely on medical devices? Yeah. So that's kind of that, personal impact, whether it directly affects you or someone you know or someone in your family, right? And as connectivity increases with these devices, so does that exposure and that attack surface of that device. Secondly, for me, was kind of that professional impact. So does anyone here work in healthcare? Your provider? Okay, we got a few, or a manufacturer. So that was the other thing. When I was working in healthcare, it was always, I was going through every year and trying to fill out like my yearly review of, hey, 1 through 5, what type of impact did you have on our mission of, patient safety and quality care? And it's like, really? Probably not a whole lot. I try to do my best to protect patient information, but, if it doesn't get leaked out here, it's going to get leaked out somewhere else with the state of healthcare security right now. And so I started to look at this increased growth of connectivity in the medical devices coming into the environment. And a lot of that had to do with the ability to pump data in real time into the medical record to do clinical decisions, to do big data analytics for population health management, things like that. And so as that grew, I said, well, let's start looking at, security of these devices and see if they're designed and engineered for security or if it's just kind of, bolted on connectivity. And so for me, finding those vulnerabilities and then working through to get those resolved, with the manufacturer, then I finally kind of had that, personal, impact that I felt on healthcare's, mission of patient safety and quality care. And so it was more rewarding for me than solely looking at it from like patient privacy aspect. The other thing I want to put out there too, is because a lot of times when we talk about this, right, we talk about like doomsday scenarios, which I think people in this room are knowledgeable enough to understand. The risk is definitely there, right? The likelihood it may not, be occurring on a daily basis, and there's many other reasons outside of cybersecurity where issues in medical devices cause loss of life on a fairly frequent basis already. But it's very important to understand that malicious intent's not a prerequisite for a patient safety issue or a loss of life. So a good story with that is there was 2 individuals that presented for treatment in a hospital in Austria, and those 2 individuals were hooked up to a PCA pump, which is a patient-controlled administration infusion pump. So it's a little clicker button that you control. They felt their pain management wasn't under control. So what did they do? Well, they went ahead and they went online. They found service and technician documentation for that infusion pump, found hard-coded credentials, got into that system, and upped the limits and suffered OD and respiratory failure issues. So that's something where it wasn't like the internet sociopath next door based on, internet connectivity of these devices. It was the patients themselves that caused an adverse safety issue due to a, security and security control that we've known has been a known failed security practice for years. So overall, what am I looking at when I look at medical device research? It's really, again, it's focused on patient safety. That's like the driving force for me. Some of this stuff, overlaps with some of the privacy, but I'm not looking at it from a patient privacy perspective or a loss of, protected health information type thing. Learning affected parties. So that's all the research that we do. We disclose through ICS Cert, coordinate with them, coordinate with the FDA, and submit all the research. And also work with, providers, which one case in here will be, or device manufacturers, which another case in here will be. And then secondly is just, general awareness of, speaking to security folks on some of the technical stuff, but also presenting outside of, the talk last night of outside the echo chamber and, speaking to healthcare industry conferences, speaking to physicians and clinicians, the people that can affect change that are actually influencing buying decisions in the healthcare environment so that they can take security into consideration before they put these devices into the environment. So phase one was really where it started, and it was first of, are the vulnerabilities that are present in these devices, real sophisticated threats and vulnerabilities, or are they basic security hygiene items? And so we spent just over almost 2 years looking at multiple devices across various modalities, so radiology systems, infusion pumps, external defibrillators, those types of devices, in order to gain an understanding of what type of vulnerabilities we've seen. And the three big vulnerabilities that we've really seen were, in fact, security hygiene issues that are present elsewhere, right? So there wasn't any, big, shockers for the security people. We've seen weak default and then hard-coded administrative credentials, both on the devices themselves, as well as doing any type of data interface calls, those types of things. We've seen known software vulnerabilities. So if you're in a healthcare environment, almost every facility, unless it's brand new and just being built, is going to have legacy devices. So they're still going to have XP devices that are running and supporting applications that interact with medical devices. And third, we see a lack of encryption being utilized. A lot of that's in transit. So with that big push towards data analytics, population health management, being able to get all of those metrics and all that real-time data from the device, we started to do medical device integration. And medical device integration, most of the providers out there, they create a proprietary protocol, which means they run over HTTP on whatever port they decide. And they push that data to a interface on a web server in an XML, and then interface that back into the medical record. So it's not secure, it's not encrypted. You can modify that, which ultimately results in data integrity issues ending up down into the medical record. So that may be one where you say, oh, well, that's a privacy issue. Yes, that's a privacy issue, but it's also potentially a security issue affecting a potential patient safety issue. Data integrity is important. So if data integrity is wrong, you end up with issues previously, there's a lot of research on high percentages of being mistreated or misdiagnosed if someone presents as yourself and incorrect information ends up into your medical record. So it would be similar to that. So after we found those device vulnerabilities, we said, hey, from an attacker perspective, what would it take to get access to these? Are these, highly segmented networks? I was in healthcare, I'd seen enough healthcare. I knew they weren't. But there were other people that came out and said, oh, these are highly segmented. They're behind firewalls. There's no way you could access these medical devices. So did some research with another researcher, Sean Merdinger. And a lot of this, full detail talk would have been probably back, the deep details was probably DEF CON 22 2 years ago when I did talk with Sean. But we searched the entire internet, found direct internet-facing medical devices, everything from diagnostic stuff to external defibrillators and vulnerabilities in those. So kind of across the board, all the way to linear accelerators. What we also found is that the healthcare organization themselves had some issues. And so we utilized Shodan. Does everyone know what Shodan is? Who knows what Shodan is? So a handful. So Shodan is essentially internet search engine. So it's like Google for the internet. So every device on the internet is getting scanned by Shodan. And as a researcher, you can utilize that tool to go in and look at banners, those types of things to see, hey, are there devices on there that are indicative of a medical device? And so I was doing, custom elite searches for medical devices like anesthesia. And in doing that, I got a hit. And I knew that it wasn't a medical device, right? The only indication that it was potentially a medical device was it was still running Windows XP. But outside of that, I knew enough. I've been playing around with these things, so I knew it wasn't a medical device. And I started to see this string of host names and stuff. And I realized, oh man, SMB has anonymous read-write to their Active Directory on the back end in this organization, and that anesthesia is actually an anesthesia cart that's just leaking out and showing me the host name of the anesthesia cart inside the organization. So I said, is it, just this one organization? It was this one organization was large, right? It had, when I looked them up, their U.S. Healthcare facility, over 12,000 employees, huge cardiovascular institution, as you'll see by the numbers of devices inside this org that I show you. And it exposed that intelligence on almost 70,000 of their systems. So it wasn't just the medical devices that were exposed. We looked at it from that medical device perspective, but it was all of their internal systems. And it provided a direct attack vector, which I'll talk about as well. It also exposed third-party connections. So organizations that you would know the name of that are utilized for lab services, for example. Or oftentimes when you go in, a radiologist does a read, that's a third-party organization. Those types of companies were in this data set, so we know they were affected and connected as well. So did we just find this one, big, huge healthcare organization with 70,000 systems that had this misconfiguration that allowed, direct attack vector into their medical device system? No, we didn't. We found hundreds very quickly just by doing some showdown searches for that, for health, clinic, hospital, medical. So anything in the organization name that had that name, it would pull back. And so that's the number of hits. You can see on some of them, over 100. Once we changed that to go to specialty type clinics, so when we changed those search terms to podiatry or pediatric or radiology or something like that, it ended up being thousands of organizations that had this exact same misconfiguration and left this exposure. So what was this exposure? Is it a treasure trove for an attacker? Or who cares, Scott? It's just SMB. What's that going to give you? Well, here's the information. So it's scrubbed out a bit, but it gives you a good idea. So over on your left, it would be the impact there for that is you can see the far left of each of those screenshots. That's the host name of the system on the network, and then you can see all the information coming out on it. So you can see EchoVAS, OR1. You can also see on the left there the screen lock 0 exception. If you know AD, what that means is you can go to that system, it's not going to lock out, right? It's got a screen lock exemption, it's not going to time out. So that's a lot of information for an attacker. Over on the right, this is the electronic medical record. So this happens to be Epic. No, this isn't an Epic issue. This is the hospital misconfiguring their network and then information leaking out about their Epic systems. So it's definitely not an Epic security issue. But if you know Epic, those are some pretty juicy servers. So there's a lot of data that sits in there. My chart down towards the bottom, that's your patient portal if you go to an Epic person to log into. Some of this Clarity, business objects, stuff like that has a lot of back-end analytical data. So what else was in there? Well, here's cardiology systems. So you can see cath lab stuff. You can also see pediatric, first floor, nuke medicine systems. You can see anesthesia OR. It did specifically, I chopped it out, but told you this was the anesthesia cart in this specific OR. And again, the host names, in many cases, you can see cath lab stuff. It gave the doctor's name, all of that. It would tell, hey, it's floor number, office number, and everything that it was associated with. So there's definitely a lot of information for an attacker. So this was that first organization that I talked about, of the thousands that we found, this is the number of devices inside that one organization that were exposed. So there's a lot there. So anesthesia, all the way to cardiology systems, MRI, PACS systems. PACS systems, what those are, is when you go and get into radiology, so your CT scanners, your MRIs, your X-rays, they all back end that imaging into a PACS system, which is basically archiving of radiology images. So there's a lot of PHI type stuff in there. PACS systems notoriously have security issues with them. I'll actually show you an example of that coming up. So what could you do from an attacker perspective, right? You have a physical attack. No one's probably going to go through that amount of effort with this type of exposure and direct attack vector, but you do have a lot of pretext information about office number, physician. You know it has a timeout exemption. You know what type of device it is and associated to what type of modality, whether that's radiology, anesthesia, those types of things. So you could do that. You could also phish. It'd be pretty simple. We all know about that. Success rates there. And then you could just create a custom payload. Now you have the host names and pivot directly to that internal. Or you could just flat out attack that external system. So as I said, that SMB was open and was misconfigured. We know it ported through to their back-end AD infrastructure because it had read-write and was porting all that information back out to us. We also know that system and those systems were XP, unpatched for MS08067, which was what configure used to exploit, and also unpatched 2003 servers. So it had SMB. It was vulnerable to 08067. Well, what do you know? That exploit runs over SMB by default. So you could directly compromise that box on those systems that was misconfigured, and then pivot to any of those internal systems which you already have the host name on. So you don't have to take control of that external system and then scan the entire network. You can be much more strategic about that. And even if people do have good controls, you're probably not going to get trapped up because you're going to be able to go to specific systems that you can pivot to. So we have these devices, right? They're vulnerable. They are connected to the internet. What would it take to get remote admin access to these devices? So what I set out to do over the last year, here's a disclosure timeline. Disclosures take a long time, at least 12 months to go through in the medical device world. We're kind of new to coordinated disclosure. I'll talk about that later. This happened to be with GE Healthcare. GE Healthcare is actually one of the more responsive manufacturers. Yep. And also know that it's important to point out that just these examples are GE specific, right? But this is a systemic issue. Like this could be any vendor, same issues, same security hygiene issues. So this is new to the industry. But I'll show you some of the CVEs. They have to do with credentials. And I'll point just a few out since we don't have full time, but if you want all of them, look at the last year DEF CON 23, and we laid them all out there. So there's just over, I think, 35 CVEs, 150 sets of credentials for remote admin access. So here's some of them, just to give you an idea. So this is a nuclear imaging system that comes through. It's kind of interesting, too, to watch, like, usernames and passwords. So Big Guy 1 is one of them. Like you can track it across like multiple product lines and then multiple years. So you'll see like CVE 2003 or 2006. Sorry, on this one. That's not that I've been like sitting on the thing since 2006. It's the fact that this is publicly available information, and through their documentation, it was listed. So in that case, when you submit a CVE, it actually goes back to that earliest iteration of that documentation that has the credentials, and that's the CVE that's identified retroactively. But it is interesting to see. So this is 2006, and you see Big Guy 1, and then you'll see it again here later on in like 2011 in another product line. So those types of things are kind of unique to look at. Telnet, root, FTP admin, username, passwords, SU accounts, root accounts, super awesome. And here's Big Guy again. So 2010. So he was back in 2006 on an MRI. Here he is in 2010 on a CT scanner. So this is PACS that I was telling you about earlier, and this is a cardiology side. So you can see the SQL SA logins. You can also see SQL SA logins for the back-end actual imaging, not the front-end server. And then outside of the SQL side, they offload those to storage devices. So oftentimes when you actually go into the application, you do have to put in credentials, right? And then it passes that through the application and retrieves it through a hard-coded credential to the back-end NAS. Well, those hard-coded credentials, in many cases, they aren't very solid. And in some cases, you can actually just go to like the NTFS permissions on the NAS devices and just dump all the radiology imaging from the PACS system. So this is the NAS one for their product, Centricity PACS, which is the big PACS system. So you can see if you want read-only, you just type RO, and if you want read-write, you just switch that to RW. So what do you do when you have like 150 sets of credentials? The best way to do that is just to create a word cloud of all the usernames and passwords. So this is the word cloud of the research we did on the radiology devices. And the funny thing is if you were paying attention, like the Big Guy and the Big Guy 1 that are in there, they actually had a leading like pound sign or hashtag, right? Well, I found out that apparently word cloud AppSec is a little bit better than medical device AppSec, and so it actually strips out and sanitizes the leading pound symbol. So I couldn't get it to accurately reflect that it was pound Big Guy, but gives you a good idea. So some of these came back. They definitely were indeed default, not necessarily hard-coded, but there was some confusing documentation that's being pushed out to providers on how to implement these systems. So I think that's important to understand. And again, this isn't just a GE issue. This is a systemic issue. If you look at, documentation that's being provided to the healthcare providers on how to implement these, you see this across the board. So documentation instructing, don't change the credentials, things like that. So I'm going to show you some examples here. This is documentation of user cannot change password. Make sure you check it. Make sure you check password never expires. So if it isn't the default, that's kind of indicative of how you would design a default credential by design, right? Important healthcare provider, don't change this password. Remote access will be disabled if you change it. Big bold, do not change this password. Tech support will log in using Awesome PC Anywhere using this username and password. And physicians, we know you love to type in passwords, but if you don't ever want to do that again, just go ahead and we'll remember it for you. Or just ask the remote station operator for your assigned username and password, which will reset your password to password. So some people, they look at it. Again, there's a clinical reason why a lot of these things were done, right? So you have to understand that. So don't just be, it's a little cynical and it's a little funny. But the reality is, there's a clinical reason why they do that. They did it by design, because of the clinical environment, and they want people not to get locked out of a system if they have to treat a patient. But we have to do better than what we're doing, right? These are known failed practices. So they think of it as a support issue. We call it a clear backdoor, and a bad thing. But it's something we got to look at. So outside of that, we have vulnerable devices. They're connected to the internet. Not too difficult to get remote admin access to those devices. So I worked with another individual who was with Protiviti, Mark Kalau, and at DEF CON this last year as well. Presented this in a little bit more detail. But we wanted to see, are people attacking these devices, and if so, what are they doing? Is it intentional malicious intent, or is it just random noise that these things are getting attacked? And so we went ahead and we stood up Honeypots. And so we did customize those to connection strings, to headers. We mimicked various devices from infusion pumps to external defibrillators to PAC systems to MRI and CT scanners. And so that's what we wanted to look for is, who was attacking them, if they're getting attacked, and what was their intent. So here's the numbers over 6 months. So we set up 10 honeypots. Successful logins, just over 55,000. So that was real-world logins. So that wasn't like blank logins. None of those devices had blank logins. But some of them were very basic, like you would catch in a word list, like admin, because that's really what the device used. I mean, we mimicked the devices to a T. So the ones that had XP, which many of them did, we mimicked that. If they weren't patched, we mimicked that. So that, yes, they were vulnerable boxes, but it was the real-world test. So we had 24 times that those devices, those 10 honeypots were actually exploited. We had just under 300 unique samples of malware that were dropped onto those honeypots. So that was very interesting to see, right? But when we looked at that, it was actually known malware, most of which was meant for scraping credit card data and sending that back and offloading it. So we can talk about that a little bit later, but it's important to know that it's unintentional, but due to the lack of forensic evidence capture in medical devices, I like to say that we have low assurance that something hasn't happened. And that, how do we know that that malware that's on there that's meant to steal your credit card data didn't cause one of those, several 100,000 events that are reported to the FDA every year about an adverse device malfunction? So how do we know that that malware didn't cause that alarm to malfunction or shut off, or cause a data integrity issue that caused a clinical decision to be incorrect? So that's something to think about. Yes, Netherlands was number one. I'm not doing attribution. I'm just telling you source countries where it was coming in. What ended up happening is Netherlands ISPs got owned, and within like 4 weeks, it jumped to the very top. Honeycred's logins, this was unique to each system. So we set up Honeycred logins for each system, for each IP, and we dumped them to Pastebin and Twitter to see if people would scrape them and then log into our medical devices that are wide open for attack. That happened 8 times. So what did we see when they got it? We actually didn't see anything. We didn't see any indication that they knew they were on a medical device, that they didn't know they were just on some other, Linux system or XP system. Are the devices, do they have malware? Are they calling back? Absolutely, I think we can say that. Did they know what they were sitting on at that point? We didn't have any indication. It seems to be random drive-bys, other than, those Honeycreds were unique because obviously someone scraped them. But we still didn't see anything indicative of, hey, they knew what type of device they were on. They were going, either to modify like config parameters or going after like IP type stuff, source code type stuff. So we didn't see any of that. So what issues do we have, right? To kind of start wrapping this up is these medical devices are increasingly accessible. Just the nature of healthcare and the openness of healthcare and needing to share that data in real time. And I think that will continue to expand with the evolution of home and digital health that we're starting to see play out here. As connectivity increases, so does our exposure and attack surface of that device. The other key thing that I think causes an issue in healthcare is that we focus and we build security programs around HIPAA, and HIPAA focuses on patient privacy. I think we need to, transition as an industry to kind of looking at security issues more from a patient safety issue as the overriding objective. Many of those patient privacy issues will kind of fall underneath that. So I think that's a big transition, something in healthcare we struggle with. We need to get out of that mindset of it's not just HIPAA. We have to have, security frameworks, and I think they got to be driven by patient safety, not focused as much on patient privacy. The third one, the FDA does not validate cyber safety controls. So to be further clear on that, the FDA has done a lot. I'm going to actually talk about some of their progress here on the next slide. But the FDA does not independently validate cyber, safety or security controls of that device prior to it, getting 510K or pre-market approval. So that does not happen. And fourthly, like I said before, it's really important to understand that, it's not just malicious intent that can result in an adverse patient safety issue, right? But there is risk there. As we connect these devices, they're clearly, connected to the internet. That connectivity increases. I mean, every sociopath's your next door neighbor on the internet. So the risk is definitely there. The possibility is there. So is it doomsday? Are we making progress? Are we trying to stay ahead of it? I think the industry in a whole, since I started doing research, has definitely changed in the last 2 years from where we were then to where we are now. Not everything's fixed, but there's a lot of good efforts going on. So the FDA has been awesome, actually, especially working with the researcher community. Absolutely incredible. The folks over there that have opened the doors. We meet with them very frequent basis to provide our kind of stakeholder input from a researcher aspect. But they released pre-market guidance, and they just released in January at the second workshop this year, post-market guidance to manufacturers on security controls about embedding security during engineering. And it's not just, that's the first step of is getting securely designed and engineered medical devices. The second step is healthcare organizations implementing them in a secure fashion. So healthcare organizations can't just point the finger to the manufacturer. In some regards, you do need secure by design, but like this misconfiguration item, that's not the fault of the manufacturer. That's the hospital themselves that opened themselves up that attack surface. So you need to think about that too. There was also a medical device workshop that took place with IEEE that I was involved in. And I think, getting out of the echo chamber, being embraced by healthcare community conferences, been really positive. Speaking at like HIMSS, if you know in healthcare, which is large, almost 50,000 people attend that. It was actually just 2 weeks ago out in Vegas. Presenting to those audiences that are clinical, that are physician, audiences that can actually impact that is very good to see us getting invited to there. Vulnerability disclosure. This is awesome. So we had 0 medical device manufacturers that had coordinated disclosure programs. I worked with Philips Healthcare, and we announced it at DEF CON 2 years ago that they were going to implement one. They implemented the first one of any medical device manufacturer a year ago, November. And so that was the very first one. And then at B-Sides Las Vegas last year, we announced, and we worked with Draeger Medical. And so they're the second organization that has a full coordinated disclosure policy for medical device manufacturers. Medtronic, they have not a full disclosure policy, but they have a dedicated method if you go to their website of how to report that, who to report that to, so it gets to the right product security people in the organization. So that's been really good, and that was backed up by this draft post-market guidance, which actually says device manufacturers, one of the components is that you will implement a coordinated disclosure policy. So that's from the FDA, and you will handle coordinated disclosure amongst these timelines, and if you don't, or if you do, this is when you need to report it to us as a safety issue. So if you're interested, really look at this like post-market guidance. It's got some good information. It is draft. I'm sure some of the timelines and stuff like that will change, but overall it's really solid. And does anyone know who I Am the Cavalry? So a couple of people. I Am the Cavalry is kind of like a grassroots security researcher effort focused on like the intersection of technology and where security meets like public safety, loss of life issues. So medical devices when they're cornerstone, auto, those types of things. They released a Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices, kind of playing on the Hippocratic Oath, but it's really security controls that could be put in place to secure these devices. So take a look at that. Lastly, you know, if you're in this space or you're interested in this space, you know, focusing on something like patient safety or even public safety, you know, it falls to everyone in the room. It's not a spectator sport. You have to get involved. I can tell you it's very rewarding, though. It's much more rewarding than just, you know, random, you know, doing day job in security, because you're giving back, right? There is something when it gets to, you know, safety issues that you can be passionate about and that you can actually have an impact. So, you know, look to do that if you're not. I Am the Cavalry is a good organization. I do collaborate with those guys. You know, look them up. They do a lot in the industry. So overall, I think, you know, going forward, just to wrap this up, only got a minute, 2 left here, is, you know, patient safety overriding objective. The second is many of these devices, we need to avoid failed practices, right? We don't always know in some cases what the right answer is, but we know what has failed. And we can't continue using failed practices. Even if we try something new and it fails, that's better than continuing to use something that we already is a known failure from a security standpoint. So it's something that we got to get better at in the medical device space and the healthcare space in general. I think if we do that, you know, we're definitely going to have a lot more resilience to kind of these accidents, this you know, and adversaries, whether that's malicious or whether that's unintentional. So thanks for coming out. Here's my contact. I got maybe like a minute to take a question if someone has it. Right here, Joe. We didn't see, so we didn't have, the question was, did we see any type of pivot once they accessed the honeypots? We didn't have a full, robust backend like infrastructure like to mimic that, so we didn't. Literally, it was just sitting at the shell, waiting for command from the C2. But we are looking to break that out, to look at more robust things like that. Like, are they pivoting? And then 2, putting, like, seeding fake PHI data, even though we don't focus on privacy, and seeding fake like source code data from an intellectual properties perspective to see if it's taken, and then see if we can find it and buy it like on the, you know, on the black market afterwards, those types of things, to track different adversarial group motivations. Good question. All right, anything else? I'll be around bar back here. So thank you guys for coming out. Appreciate it.